At 14 years old, I watched Snow White with the Red Hair for the first time and instantly fell head over heels in love with the series. I think the main reason for this, and the reason I tell people when they ask me why I love it so much, is because it's so beautiful. The setting, the clothes, the jewellery, the little details, even down to the plants and herbs themselves, they all spoke to me in a way that nothing else ever had. I was entranced. I needed this beauty for myself. So, in my typical creative and overambitious 14-year-old way, I decided there and then that I would bring this world to life. I spent hours carefully designing and planning how I would create the pieces that captivated me so much. Some nights I was so excited by these plans of mine that I couldn't get to sleep for hours, having too much fun turning the ideas over in my head like puzzles to be solved. I'll give a very brief explanation of what Snow White with the Red Hair is and the things you'll need to know to understand what's going on in this video, just in case you've never heard of it before. This is one of the first Snow White with the Red Hair related videos on my channel, and there are many more to come, so soon enough you'll be an expert. Snow White with the Red Hair is a shoujo romance series written by Sorata Akizuki. The manga has been running since 2006, and the series received an anime adaptation in 2015, with season 2 being released in 2016, and this was around the time I got into the series through the anime. Without getting into too much detail here, because this video is long enough as it is, the series has a medieval fantasy setting and has a lot to do with kingdoms and princes and the like. Clarines Kingdom is where much of the story takes place. The first thing from the series I decided to make was Clarines ID tag. If you're not familiar with it, they're pieces of identification canonically held by every character who works in and with Wistal Castle, required as a token of passage through the castle gates. By this point, I still hadn't started reading the manga, so all I knew was the beautiful jewel-bright colours of the anime style of them. In this video, I will explain my entire 4-year process of conceptualising and creating these ID tags from start to finish. I wish I'd kept more of a record as I went along, but sadly all I've got to rely on are the random photos I took along the way, my WhatsApp history, and my memory. I'm also making a video detailing my current successful process, and I intend to have it posted in the summer, and I'll link it on my website as well as my Amino when it's done. Let's get into it. I don't have any early records of when I first watched the series or began to come up with the ideas to make these things, but I knew I must have been thinking about it from very soon after I first watched the anime. I started collecting reference images in September 2018, and the earliest I can find of me telling people about this project was in November of 2018, which is the same time that I joined the Snow White with the Red Hair Amino and made this post asking if people knew any other canon colours of ID tags. I remember that when I made this post, I wasn't really actually asking, as I knew all the colours already, and I really just wanted to test if people would guess what I was planning to do with this information. They didn't. At that time, I really thought the project would take a few months at most, so I was very fond of hinting to people that I had this big project planned, and I would ask my friends their favourite colours and what job they'd do if they worked at a castle, with the intent of making them an ID tag each when I'd finally figured out the process. I didn't tell people about what the project actually was until several years down the line, when it was clear that this was going to take a lot longer than I'd anticipated. Over the years, a lot of other projects and decisions I made, both for real life and for fun, were directly influenced by my desire to see this project through to the end. My plan was to cast a frame in brass, complete with the Clarines emblem, and have the colour on the inside be glass and the strap leather. I had cast pewter before at school in design tech, so I had an idea of what I was doing. I carefully drew up plans and technical drawings of the piece, so I had consistent reference with measurements. I remember the first plan I drew, I just chose an arbitrary measurement and drew it based on that, but the pendant ended up being 7 centimetres long. I'm lucky my dad pointed out that that was insane, otherwise I might have actually tried to go through with it. Around February 2018, I made some cast pewter jewellery from a different fandom as a gift for a friend. I made the patterns from Fimo, which was a horrible decision with hindsight, and I simply placed them in the bottom of a Tupperware and poured plaster of Paris over them to make the mould. Pewter has such a low melting point that it can be melted on the stove, so with the help of my dad, a friend and I made 3 successful pewter casts in my kitchen. They're messy and way too heavy to be feasibly worn as jewellery outside of cosplay, but I was delighted with the results nonetheless. This small project was partially for fun, but also to figure out how to make metal casts at home, seeing as at school we had used specialist equipment. Overall, I would say this was pretty successful for what it was. In October 2018, I began experimenting with the lost wax process. This is a method of casting where you encase a wax mould in plaster of Paris, and then melt the wax out so a hollow cavity is left to be filled with molten metal. I used wax from 3 tea light candles, which never quite ended up working. At the time, I had no idea I needed special wax for carving and casting, but that's something I would only learn years later. What I was trying to do here was to cast a slab of wax from which I could cut the frame. I used plasticine to contain the melted wax, which mostly worked, but then I had the big problem that I'd poured it all directly onto the kitchen countertop and it got stuck. I remember I had to spend ages trying to scrape it all off. Looking back now, I really just have to facepalm at my younger self for this idea. 2 months after I had joined the Snow White with the Red Hair amino, I started posting about making tiny apple charms. The first of these is from December 2018, and I somehow continued talking about them all the way up until August the next year. I had carved a tiny apple charm from some plaster of Paris and later received silicone moulding paste as a Christmas gift from my dad, so I began experimenting with making successful wax moulds of the apple. It worked to some extent, but I was forever ending up with bubbles or not managing to shut the mould quite straight. I've got a million little slightly wonky apples in a jar in my casting box that I've never had the heart to get rid of. I won't go into too much detail about these apple charms here because they were just a step on my way to making the ID tags, but if you would like to read the posts, you can read them on my amino, although they're not that interesting. Ultimately, I gave up on the idea of casting the ID tag frames using lost wax. In February 2019, I made this frame out of aluminium wire. I don't think I had big plans for it was mostly to get an idea of the size the pendant would end up being. I seem to remember I made it on a whim, probably to procrastinate from doing homework. August 2019 was a point when I felt that the project was starting to look possible. For school, I had taken an extended essay module. I had built a mini foundry to melt and cast metal. I said before that I made a lot of decisions with the direct intent to help me make the Clarines ID tags, and this was one of them. The only reason I wanted a foundry was for casting brass. The project's success was debatable, but I got an A for the essay, so I was happy, and happier still as I now had an accessible way to cast metal in my back garden. Small side note that this same month, my grandma asked what I intended to do with the foundry, so I wrote her a very enthusiastic 5-page illustrated letter explaining all the casting projects from Snow White with the Red Hair that I want to do. Sorry, Nana. In September 2019, I made a wooden pattern for the pendant frame and made a casting box. I had learned about green sand and decided to cast using that rather than the lost wax method. I had an advantage since the frame would be mostly flat. I wanted the Clarines emblem to be raised, which is why I felt that casting would work best. I would have had to lay to half the depth of the frame at the hinge, but that wasn't too bad. Hey, it's me from the future. It turns out my camera wasn't recording, so I had to do this whole bit again. I didn't get to work on this project again until well into lockdown. I was in my last year of school before COVID, and I was so insanely busy with exams that I had no time to think about anything else. I took 2020 as my first gap year, but I didn't touch this project again until October, but I did a lot of other small projects and drawings within the fandom during that time. By this point I'd been gripped with an honestly insane idea. I'd been researching a lot on DIY methods of melting metal for casting, and one of them looked like a great idea. It seemed from numerous sources online that it would be possible to safely melt metal using a microwave. I even found one guy selling microwave metal melting kits complete with everything you'd need. I did my research and it seemed that I wasn't going to explode if I tried, so I drove myself to Enfield to pick up a second-hand microwave I'd bought for £30. Long story short, it didn't work. It didn't blow me to pieces, but all it achieved was warming the metal just a bit after more than 30 minutes in the microwave. I'd put the metal inside a graphite crucible, inside my firebrick foundry, surrounded by ceramic wool, so possibly it was a bit too insulated, but I was just following what I'd seen all the other people had done, and somehow it had worked for all of them. To this day, I'm still frustrated by the fact that I never figured out why this method didn't work, because it would have been absolutely perfect. From the start, I'd wanted an induction foundry, but I didn't have the skills to make one or the money to buy one, and the microwave had seemed like the perfect solution. I've now learned that microwave foundries do actually exist. I'm thinking of investing in one and trying again. Recently, I watched an Extractions and Ire video where he used it to melt silver, which has a melting point of 960 degrees Celsius, so it's definitely possible to melt metals, including brass, but being fast enough to pour them into the mould before they solidify will be a different challenge. I was annoyed because I'd set myself up to cast with the expectation that the microwave would have worked. I tried a handful of times to make a good mould with the petrol-bonded green sand I'd bought, and eventually managed to get a good one. I kept this after the failure of the microwave, and a few days later I admitted defeat and melted the brass using some good old blowtorches. It was semi-successful. I had one blowtorch on each side of the crucible. One of them was really good quality, but the other was not, and struggled to hold its flame, sputtering a lot. The brass melted eventually, and I did manage to pour it into the mould, but it solidified really quickly and didn't flow into the channels as well as I'd wanted, so I just ended up with 2 puddles. The parts where the frame did cast are really iffy, so this ultimately proved to me that my method really wasn't good enough, and casting the frame, annoyingly, wasn't feasible for me at the moment. The other things that went sort of wrong but didn't really impact the project were that the nozzle of the bad blowtorch was brass, and I was melting brass, so the nozzle melted. Also, the petrol-bonded sand caught fire as soon as I poured the molten metal in, because obviously petrol is really flammable. It smelled super bad too. It's kind of a mystery to me why it's used for casting, which requires high heat. The crucible also didn't take kindly to the direct heat of the blowtorches, and was worn away quite significantly on one side. Next time I buy a crucible, because I still do want to cast other things, I'll invest in a graphite crucible with a ceramic shell, which should make it better insulated and more resistant to being worn away by the torches if I use them. Later that same month, I actually did a successful casting for a different project. I made Kiki's earrings for a friend and fellow fan of Snow White with the Red Hair. You can read about it on my Amino if you'd like to know how I did it. I then took a very long hiatus from the project for almost a year as I went travelling on my second gap year. In January of 2022, I had the privilege of doing 3 weeks work experience at Patrick Mavros's Harari studio. I was incredibly lucky to have been accepted. If you don't know, Patrick Mavros is a world-famous silversmith who makes cast sterling silver jewellery and ornaments. I worked in the shop and studio for 3 weeks while also getting the chance to watch the masters at work and give it a go for myself. While I learned a lot from this experience, the main thing it taught me about casting is that my thrown-together shed method is very bad, and I am in no way ready to start casting things properly. This definitely doesn't mean that casting's off the table for me forever, absolutely not. I just don't have the time, space or resources right now to be able to get it working. I'd love to be able to cast things properly one day, but for now, I had to find another way. This meant that for the ID tag, I almost had to completely change tactics. I decided to go with an alternate method I'd discussed with my dad, which was to cut the frame out of a sheet of brass. I really hadn't wanted to do this because it would be significantly more time consuming than casting the frame, but it was the only other real option I had left, so I had no choice. In March 2022, I bought a 3mm plate of brass and I was ready to go. I had bought most of the other elements like the glass and the crystals in October of 2020 with the anticipation that the casting would have worked, so I already had most things that I needed. From here on, this is pretty much my final process that I follow today. If you would like to learn about it, I'll be making a video documenting all my steps as I mentioned before, so I won't go into so much detail here, except for the trials and errors I encountered. I began by tracing my wooden pattern onto the sheet of brass. I now know that that pattern is not very accurate at all, and the sides are very, very thick compared to what I actually needed. Next, I got COVID and couldn't do anything for 2 weeks. Just what I needed right as my dream project was beginning to take off. Once I was better, I got to work again. I cut out the frames using a jigsaw, which in hindsight was really not the best tool for the job. It was too aggressive and the blade was too big for the scale of the project, so overall I found it really difficult. The brass plate was so small that just clamping it to the workbench took up most of the plate, and trying to get the jigsaw running smoothly was a huge challenge. I also cut 2 frames at once because the plate would have been too small to even clamp had I cut 1 frame at a time on the plate. After that, I could begin filing it so it was smooth and the right size. I filed for what seemed like years. I started my work outside on the garden wall, which was a really bad height because I didn't have much power and I couldn't see what I was doing. I actually ended up filing the frame at an angle that I then had to correct, which is why the frame for the prototype ended up so much thinner than others I've made, where I followed my drawing's dimensions properly. To be honest though, I actually think that the thinner frame looks better than the thicker one. Next, I cut the channels for the glass to sit in. This took me forever, because I was not using the right tool for the job. I used diamond Dremel bits because I didn't realise we had HSS bits for the Dremel. When I was about halfway through with the diamond bits, I switched to the HSS bits and suddenly the thing I'd been finding hard became easy. After that, I cut a piece of glass as a test. I had 2 shades of amber that looked exactly the same, so I figured that one of those pieces wouldn't be missed if this went wrong. I'd never cut glass before, so I was quite nervous, but it went well. Then I ground the edges to the piece of glass until it fit into both sides of the frame. The next challenge I faced was engraving the Clarines emblem into the bottom of the frame. Half the reason I'd wanted to cast the frame in the first place was to be able to have the emblem be raised as it appears in the anime. However, that now wasn't an option for me, so I had to do the next best thing and engrave it. This took quite a bit of research on what method would be best, but I eventually learned that I could do copper sulfate electrolysis since the frame is brass. This article was absolutely instrumental in getting this process working for me. I tested this out on a small corner of brass I'd cut off. I cut a crude pattern using my pocket knife from a piece of electrical tape. I used some random wires for the electrodes, one of which I knew was aluminium and the other which I thought was also aluminium, but is probably zinc or some other metal because it literally turned the electrolysis backwards. The piece you want engraved is meant to be hooked up to the positive side of the battery, and I had everything connected the right way around, but for some reason this wire plated the design with copper rather than engraving it. Once I swapped the thin wire for another aluminium one, the process worked properly. I'm honestly delighted I got this working, because I could never get my head around electrolysis when I was learning it in school, and even now I don't really understand it, but I still made it work in my garage. I then engraved the emblem onto the frame and cut out the final corner. Before folding the frame, I filed down the hinge to half the width of the plate. The opposite side to the glass channel should be filed, but I have once managed to file the wrong side and there really is no going back if that happens. It turned out okay, but I will forever be sad about it. Next was to fold the frame. I was a little nervous about this as I knew there was a possibility the hinge could snap if I folded it without annealing the metal every time I bent it further. However, it luckily passed without a hitch and I tidied up the edges of the frame with a file. The next step was so unnecessarily painful. I had to drill holes in all 4 corners for the rivets, as well as drilling a hole for the crystal to hang at the bottom, a hole for the necklace cord to hang at the top, and a decorative triangular hole at the base of the hinge. I can't even tell you how many drill bits I broke here, but it must have been 7 or 8. I think the problem is that the angle of the bits was way too small for what brass needs. They're such tiny drill bits at 1mm, so they break more easily anyway, but this was just ridiculous. I eventually managed it, but this was by far the most soul-destroying part of the process I had encountered. While I was fighting with the drilling, I decided to take a break and cut and engrave the glass I was actually going to use. I went with clear glass because I couldn't decide on a colour. It all went well until I put it in the vise with the other pieces of glass I'd previously cut to try and grind the clear glass to the right shape. For some reason, I didn't consider that glass is not flexible, and the stained glass I use is float glass, so it's not perfectly flat either. All this being said, I tightened the vise too much and broke the glass, so I had to cut another piece. I learned from my mistakes and successfully ground the new piece to the right size. Then came the engraving. I was very nervous about this because I knew that if I messed up, there was no going back. I tested it out on the test glass first, and it went better than expected, so I went ahead and engraved the piece I would be using. I think I used a rounded drill bit, and I must have engraved with an angle because the lines are not as thin as they were once I got the hang of it and gained confidence in later pieces. Finally, I finished up the drilling and painstakingly filed the top hole to a triangle as best I could. It was really hard since there's almost no surface to file on, so I would like to find a triangular punch so I could just drill the hole and punch it to the right shape. I've also actually missed a detail here, which I didn't realise until much later, and is also something I've managed to miss again on a couple of other pieces. There should be a line going through the centre of the hinge, like so. If you have an ID tag from me and I've managed to miss this out on yours too, then sorry, just think of it as being unique. Once I gave the whole frame a good polish, I could add the glass and rivet it shut. The glass is held in with a tiny bit of epoxy resin, partially to make sure it stays put, but also to provide it with a bit of support against the frame. It would probably be fine without, and this breaks my rule of only using materials that would be used in the Snow White with the Red Hair universe, but I wanted the extra assurance. I made rivets from 0.8mm brass wire. I folded the top and squashed it together in crimping pliers. I didn't really crimp it, more just squashed it flat. The way I kept the rivets in on my ID tag was to punch the backs of the wires to make them wider than the holes they're in. It's worked well enough that they haven't fallen out, but I updated my methods the more pieces I made. I missed the top right corner on mine, luckily at the back, and now I have an extra dent. Finally, I added the findings, crystal and cord, and finally, my dream project was finished after almost 4 years. I was actually over the moon. Sure, it looked a bit of a mess, and it had been an experiment all the way through, but I'd done it. It sounds kind of stupid, but being able to complete this project really said to me that I could do anything if I put my mind to it. Even something like this, which seemed so huge and intimidating in the beginning, that at times I really wondered if I could make it work out, I managed to pull off in my back garden with a lot of perseverance. I absolutely need to give a huge thank you to my dad for all his help and the use of his tools. I absolutely could not have managed this without his ideas and expertise. I'm also working on a video documenting all my steps for my current process, which will be coming soon. I may or may not also make that into a blog. People have said to me that I shouldn't be giving away my secrets, but honestly, they're not secrets, and I feel like this isn't mine to protect either. The design doesn't belong to me, obviously, and I won't try and pretend that it does. The method isn't exactly hard to figure out either, and if you want to make one of these for yourself using my method, by all means, please go ahead. If you can improve any part of it or get things working that I couldn't, I tip my hat to you, and I'd love to hear from you what you've done. This is a fandom project, and I want to share the creativity and love for the series with all the other fans of Snow-Eyed the Red Hare out there. Half the joy of fandom is sharing and creating with other people who love this thing as much as you do, and that's the culture that I want to promote here. Many more projects are to come, and I'm so excited to be able to share them with you all. Thank you so much for watching. I know this has been a long video compared to what I've done before, so I hope you found it interesting.